The smell of smoky barbecue drifted through the summer air as Jack fired up his trusty old grill, just like he had every Sunday for the past 15 years. His kids played in the backyard, their laughter mixing with the sizzle of marinated chicken hitting the hot grates. His wife Susan was setting up the outdoor table, humming along to the old country music playing softly from their patio speakers. "Dad, can I help flip the burgers?" asked his youngest, Tommy, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Jack smiled, remembering how he'd learned grilling from his own father. "Sure, buddy. Just remember what I taught you about." A sharp voice cut through their peaceful afternoon like a knife. Hey you." Heavy footsteps pounded across the lawn as their new neighbor stormed toward them, his face red with anger. He was still wearing his pressed business suit despite it being a Sunday afternoon, and his perfectly polished shoes were getting stained by the dewy grass. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to my house? The smoke is getting everywhere. My curtains will smell like your food for weeks." Mr. Peterson jabbed his finger toward their grill, his hand shaking. "This is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable." Tommy stepped behind his father, clutching the spatula like a shield. Susan stopped arranging the plates, her hands frozen mid-task. The neighbors' shouting had drawn the attention of other families on their street, with curious faces peeking out from behind curtains. Jack slowly wiped his hands on his Kiss the Cook apron, his expression surprisingly calm. Most people knew him as quick to joke and smile, but there was something different in his eyes now. Not anger, but something deeper, more thoughtful. "I understand your concern," Jack said quietly, his voice steady. "Would you like to join us? We can talk about it over dinner." The neighbor seemed taken aback by this response, clearly expecting a fight. "Join you? Are you kidding me? I'm filing a complaint with the HOA first thing tomorrow." He spun around and stormed back to his house, slamming his front door so hard that his own welcome wreath fell to the ground. Susan walked over to Jack, placing a hand on his arm. "Honey, are you okay? I've never seen you so calm during a confrontation." Their older kids had stopped playing and were watching from the treehouse, whispering among themselves. Jack turned back to the grill, adjusting the heat with practiced hands. His face held an expression that his family had never seen before, like he was carrying a heavy secret. "Sometimes," he said softly, mostly to himself, "people have reasons for being angry that we don't understand yet." The rest of their afternoon was quieter than usual. The food was still delicious. Jack's secret marinade never failed, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The kids kept glancing at their neighbor's house, where all the blinds were now tightly closed. Even the usual after-dinner game of catch in the yard felt subdued, as if they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their well-loved backyard, Jack stood looking at his neighbor's house for a long moment. Susan caught him making a phone call later that evening, speaking in hushed tones and writing something in his old work notebook, the one he kept from his days at the fire department. That night, as the stars came out and the embers of their BBQ cooled, none of them realized that this was just the beginning. Their peaceful suburban life was about to change in ways they never could have imagined, all because of a grumpy neighbor and a father's hidden connection to a tragedy that happened 5 years ago. Monday morning arrived with a stack of official-looking letters in the Andersons' mailbox. Mr. Peterson had been busy. Complaints about their grass being half an inch too tall, about Tommy's bicycle left in the driveway, and even about the color of their mailbox not matching HOA standards perfectly. Susan sighed as she sorted through them at the kitchen table. "He's really not letting this go, is he?" she said, watching through the window as their neighbor stood in his driveway, taking pictures of their house with his phone. He was already dressed in another crisp suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, looking more like a property inspector than a neighbor. The kids noticed the change in their once peaceful neighborhood too. Every time they stepped into the backyard to play, Mr. Peterson would appear at his window, camera in hand, documenting their every move. Little Tommy stopped asking to play on his swing set and their teenage daughter, Rachel, kept her volleyball practice confined to the front yard, away from his watchful eyes. "Dad, why don't you do something?" Rachel asked one evening, after Mr. Peterson had called the police about their porch light being too bright. "This is getting ridiculous." Jack just kept washing the dishes, that same mysterious calm on his face. "Sometimes," he said, "fighting back just makes things worse." He glanced at the stack of complaints on the counter. "Trust me on this one." But the situation kept escalating. Mr. Peterson started sending emails to all the neighbors, warning them about the dangerous cooking practices next door. He created a detailed log of every time the Andersons used their grill, complete with wind direction readings and smoke pattern analysis. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so aggressive. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon. Susan was teaching Tommy how to plant tomatoes in their small garden when Mr. Peterson marched over, waving a thick document in his hand. "I've filed a formal complaint with the city," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "Your BBQ smoke is a public nuisance. They'll be sending an inspector, and then we'll see about these weekly cookouts of yours." Tommy dropped his little gardening shovel, dirt spilling across his shoes. Susan stood up, finally losing her patience. "Mr. Peterson, this has gone too far. We've lived here for 15 years without—" "Mom," Rachel called from the back door, her voice strange. "Dad's on the phone with someone. He looks like he's crying." Susan turned to see Jack through the kitchen window, holding his old work phone, his shoulders shaking slightly as he spoke. In all their years of marriage, she'd only seen him cry twice, at their wedding and when Tommy was born. That evening, Jack spent hours in his home office, pulling out old boxes labeled Station 42 records. Through the door, the family could hear him shuffling papers and making more phone calls, his voice serious and professional, so different from his usual cheerful tone. "Something's not right," Rachel whispered to her mom as they prepared dinner, sandwiches, since the grill was now off limits. "Dad knows something about Mr. Peterson, doesn't he?" Susan watched her husband through the office window, seeing how he carefully laid out old newspaper clippings and incident reports across his desk. The last time she'd seen him this focused was years ago, when he was still serving as fire chief and handling a major case. As night fell, Mr. Peterson's house stood dark and silent across the yard, like a shadow hanging over their family's happiness. But through the office window, Jack's desk lamp burned late into the night, illuminating scattered papers and old photographs that would soon reveal a truth none of them could have imagined, a truth that would change everything. The city inspector arrived on a crisp morning, clipboard in hand, looking bored as he measured the distance between the Andersons' grill and their property line. Mr. Peterson hovered nearby, pointing out what he claimed were dangerous smoke patterns and hazardous cooking conditions. "I've documented everything," Mr. Peterson insisted, shoving a thick folder at the inspector. 15 Sundays in a row, they've subjected the neighborhood to this nuisance. His hands trembled as he spoke, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like fear. The inspector sighed, jotting down some notes. "Until we complete our investigation, I'm afraid you'll have to cease all outdoor cooking activities," he told Jack, who nodded quietly. As the inspector walked away, Mr. Peterson stood in his driveway with his arms crossed, a small, sad victory written across his face. That Sunday felt wrong. The backyard was silent. No sizzling burgers, no laughing kids, no neighbors dropping by with side dishes. The old grill stood covered and cold, like a forgotten friend. Tawny pressed his face against the kitchen window, watching rain clouds gather overhead. "It's not fair," he mumbled, drawing shapes in the condensation on the glass. "We didn't do anything wrong." Rachel found her dad in his office that afternoon, surrounded by even more papers than before. She was about to ask him about dinner when something caught her eye. An old newspaper clipping partially hidden under a folder. The headline made her freeze. "Tragic house fire claims family of 4." "Dad?" Her voice wavered. "What is this?" Jack looked up, his eyes tired and red. He'd been making calls all weekend, speaking in hushed tones with old colleagues from the fire department. Now, seeing his daughter's confused face, he seemed to deflate slightly. "Sit down, honey," he said softly, pulling out a chair. "There's something you need to understand about Mr. Peterson." But before he could continue, they heard a commotion outside. Susan's voice carried through the open window, sounding worried. "Please, Mr. Peterson, you need to calm down." They rushed to the front yard. Mr. Peterson stood on their lawn, soaking wet from the light rain, clutching more papers in his shaking hands. But something was different this time. His usual anger seemed to have cracked, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "Do you know what it's like?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "To smell smoke," and he stopped, the papers falling from his hands, scattering across the wet grass like broken memories. "Every Sunday I smell it. And I remember." Jack stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately. The rain was getting heavier now, but neither man seemed to notice. The whole neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, watching from behind curtained windows. "I know, Robert," Jack said quietly, using Mr. Peterson's first name for the first time. "I was there that night." Mr. Peterson's head snapped up, really looking at Jack for the first time since he'd moved in. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by a flood of emotions: shock, anger, grief, and something else, something that looked almost like relief. "You?" he whispered, taking the stumbling step backward. "You were the fire chief who—" Thunder rumbled in the distance as the two men stood facing each other in the rain. Rachel and Tommy watched from the porch, holding hands tightly. Susan moved to stand beside them, understanding finally beginning to dawn on her face. The truth that Jack had been carrying all these weeks was about to come out. A truth about a terrible night 5 years ago, about loss and guilt and healing, about why he'd remained so calm in the face of Mr. Peterson's anger. As the rain fell harder, washing away the scattered papers on the lawn, they all realized that their Sunday BBQs had never really been about the food at all. They'd been about family, about community, and about the kind of healing that only time and understanding could bring. That evening, after the rain had stopped and Mr. Peterson had disappeared back into his house, Rachel couldn't sleep. The newspaper clipping she'd seen in her father's office kept floating through her mind. While everyone else had gone to bed, she crept downstairs to the office, flashlight in hand. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting shadows across the scattered papers on her dad's desk. With trembling fingers, she began to read. The first article was dated exactly 5 years ago. A family barbecue gone wrong. A grill left unattended. A wooden deck that caught fire. The flames had spread so quickly that by the time the fire department arrived, Rachel's hand flew to her mouth as she read further. Mr. Peterson had lost everything that night. His wife, his 2 young children, even their family dog. The article described him as a devastated local business owner who had watched helplessly as his world burned down. But it was another document that made her heart stop. Her father's official incident report. Page after page of detailed notes in his familiar handwriting, describing how he'd led the rescue attempt, how they tried everything to reach the family trapped upstairs, how he'd had to physically restrain Mr. Peterson from running back into the inferno. "I thought I might find you here," came her father's quiet voice from the doorway. Rachel jumped, papers scattering across the desk. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snoop, but I had to know." Jack walked in and sat heavily in his office chair, picking up one of the fallen photographs. It showed a younger, smiling Mr. Peterson with his family in front of a Christmas tree. "I kept every article, every report," he said softly. "Sometimes, when really bad things happen on the job, you can't just file them away and forget." "Is that why you've been so patient with him?" Rachel asked, pieces finally clicking into place. "Why you never got angry when he complained?" Her father nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "The moment I saw him moving in next door, I recognized him. How could I forget? It was the worst night of my career." He paused, looking out the window toward Mr. Peterson's dark house. But he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't want to. Trauma does strange things to memory. Rachel looked at another photo, the charred remains of a backyard grill, surrounded by yellow police tape. "It wasn't his fault, was it?" she whispered. "No," Jack said quietly. "It was his neighbor's grill that caused the fire. They'd been having a BBQ too, right next to the wooden fence between their yards. One spark, that's all it took." He picked up his old badge, turning it over in his hands. "That's why he can't stand the smell of our barbecues. Every time he smells smoke." He remembers that night, Rachel finished, her heart aching for the angry man next door who suddenly seemed much less angry and much more broken. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell him," Jack admitted. "How to let him know that I understand his pain, that I was there, that I've carried that night with me too. But how do you start a conversation like that?" Through the window, they saw a light flick on in Mr. Peterson's house. The lone figure stood at the window, looking out into the night. Rachel watched as her father pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began to write. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Writing him a letter," Jack replied, his pen moving steadily across the page. "It's time he knew the whole story. And maybe," he glanced at the covered grill in their backyard, barely visible in the moonlight, "maybe it's time we all started healing." As Rachel headed back to bed, she realized that their Sunday BBQs would never be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, they could become something even more meaningful. A symbol not just of family tradition, but of understanding, forgiveness, and the kind of courage it takes to face your deepest fears. The next morning, Jack stood at his front door for a long time, letter in hand, watching the sun rise over Mr. Peterson's house. He'd rewritten that letter 7 times during the night, each version trying to find the right words to bridge 5 years of pain. Susan came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You know, in 15 years of marriage, I've never seen you this nervous," she said softly. "When you're a firefighter," Jack replied, his voice rough with emotion, "they train you for everything. How to run into burning buildings, how to save lives, how to deal with loss. But they never teach you how to face the ones you couldn't save." The morning dew was still fresh on the grass as Jack walked across his lawn. Each step felt heavier than the last. He'd made this walk 1,000 times in his dreams, replaying that terrible night, wondering if he could have done something differently, moved faster, tried harder. As he reached Mr. Peterson's door, he heard movement inside. His hand shook slightly as he raised it to knock. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet morning air. The door opened, and Mr. Peterson stood there in his bathrobe, looking older and more tired than usual. The anger that had become his trademark was absent, replaced by the raw vulnerability that glimpsed in the rain yesterday. "I need to show you something," Jack said quietly, pulling out his old firefighter's badge along with the letter. "Something I should have shown you the day you moved in." Mr. Peterson's eyes fixed on the badge, and his face went pale. His hands gripped the doorframe as recognition washed over him. "You," he whispered. "You were there. You were the one who held you back," Jack finished. "Who had to make the call to pull my men out when the roof started collapsing. Who had to listen to your screams and know there was nothing more we could do." Mr. Peterson's legs seemed to give out, and he sank down onto his front step. Jack sat down beside him, keeping a respectful distance. The morning birds sang cheerfully, unaware of the heavy silence between the two men. "Every Sunday," Mr. Peterson said finally, his voice barely audible, "when I smell your barbecue, I can feel the heat of the flames again. I can hear my wife calling for help. My children." His voice broke. "I know," Jack said gently. "That's why I never argued with your complaints, why I kept trying to find ways to show you that you were safe here, that history doesn't have to repeat itself." He handed Mr. Peterson the letter. Inside was not just an explanation, but detailed plans for a new grilling safety initiative Jack wanted to start in their community. Safety workshops, modern equipment demonstrations, early warning systems, everything he'd learned in 20 years of firefighting. "I couldn't save your family that night," Jack said, his own eyes filling with tears. "I've carried that weight every day since, but maybe together we can help make sure no one else has to go through what you did." Mr. Peterson read the letter slowly, his hands trembling less with each page. When he looked up, something had changed in his eyes, as if a wall he built 5 years ago was finally starting to crack. "Your daughter," he said suddenly, "the one who plays volleyball. She's the same age my Katie would have been." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Rachel would have loved her. They probably would have been friends. A delivery truck rumbled past, breaking the morning stillness. Tommy's voice drifted from the Andersons' yard as he got ready for school. Life was going on around them, as it always did. "I don't know if I can ever smell barbecue again without remembering," Mr. Peterson admitted. "You don't have to forget," Jack replied gently. "But maybe with time, we can help you create new memories, better ones, together." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, two men sat on a front step, surrounded by the weight of shared history and the possibility of a different future. Sometimes healing begins not with forgetting the past, but with finding the courage to face it beside someone who understands. The following days brought subtle changes to the neighborhood. The formal complaints stopped arriving in the mail. The constant photography of the Andersons' yard ceased. Instead, something new began. A quiet ritual that started with a covered dish left on Mr. Peterson's doorstep. It was a simple meal of grilled chicken, but prepared in the kitchen, not on the barbecue. Attached was a note in Jack's handwriting. "Made this with a new safety timer system. Would love your thoughts on making it even safer." Mr. Peterson found the dish when he returned from work. He stood on his porch for a long time, staring at it, before finally taking it inside. The next morning, the clean container sat on the Andersons' porch with a small note. "The chicken was good. My wife used to make it similar." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without his voice breaking. The next day, another dish appeared, this time with detailed notes about kitchen safety features Jack had installed. The day after that, a folder containing modern grill safety regulations and a proposal for neighborhood workshops. Each delivery was a small step, a gentle invitation to heal. Tommy, who had always been scared of the angry man next door, watched from his bedroom window as Mr. Peterson picked up each day's offering. "Dad," he asked one evening, "why do you keep giving him food?" Jack smiled, stirring a pot of his special marinara sauce. "Sometimes, buddy, people need to be shown that what they're afraid of can also bring comfort. Like how you were scared of thunder until we started counting seconds between flashes and making it into a game." The neighborhood noticed the change too. Mrs. Wilson from across the street stopped Jack one morning while he was getting the newspaper. "I saw Robert, Mr. Peterson, actually wave at someone yesterday," she said, amazement in her voice. "First time since he moved in." The biggest surprise came a week later. Jack was installing a new smoke detector system in his backyard cooking area when a shadow fell across his work. He looked up to find Mr. Peterson standing there, hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable but determined. I used to be pretty good with electronics," Mr. Peterson said quietly. "Before everything. Maybe I could help." Jack handed him a screwdriver without hesitation. They worked in companionable silence, installing sensors that would monitor wind direction and smoke levels. Mr. Peterson's hands, which had so often been clenched in anger, now moved with precise care as he connected wires and adjusted settings. "We had a system like this at our old house," he said suddenly, his voice distant. "After it happened, I found out it had been installed wrong. The batteries were dead." He tightened a screw with perhaps more force than necessary. "If I had just checked." Jack put down his tools. "Robert," he said gently, "we can't change what happened, but we can help others learn from it." As if on cue, Susan came out with 2 glasses of lemonade. She'd been watching from the kitchen window, hardly daring to breathe for fear of breaking this fragile moment of progress. Mr. Peterson accepted the glass with a small nod of thanks, the first time he'd taken anything from them. "I've been thinking about your safety workshop idea," Mr. Peterson said after a while, staring into his lemonade. I might know some people from my support group. They might be interested in helping." Jack looked up, surprised and moved. He knew what it cost this proud man to mention his grief support group. "That would be amazing," he said simply. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, two men continued their work, each sensor and safety feature a small step towards something neither of them could quite name yet. It wasn't friendship, not exactly, but it was a beginning. A shared purpose growing from shared pain. Rachel, watching from her window, saw Mr. Peterson actually smile when Jack cracked a dad joke about wire strippers. It was a small smile, rusty from disuse, but it was real. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures. A covered dish, a shared tool, a moment of understanding between two people who had both been carrying too much weight alone. The day of the first neighborhood safety workshop arrived with golden autumn sunshine. Jack stood in his driveway, arranging chairs and demonstration equipment, when he heard familiar footsteps approaching. Mr. Peterson was early, carrying a box of pamphlets he created about fire prevention. "I was up all night making these," he said, his voice rough. "Kept rewriting them. Wanted to get the tone right." He pulled out one of the pamphlets, and Jack could see his hands trembling slightly. On the cover was a photo of a family, Mr. Peterson's family, smiling in front of their old house. "Are you sure about using this picture?" Jack asked gently. Mr. Peterson nodded, straightening his collar. "People need to see that it can happen to anyone, that a normal family on a normal Sunday can." He stopped, took a deep breath. They need to see what they could lose. As neighbors began arriving for the workshop, they did double takes at the sight of Mr. Peterson, standing beside Jack, helping to set up. The man who had once filmed their every move was now handing out safety booklets with quiet determination. Tommy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, can I show them my new safety checklist?" He'd spent days creating a kid-friendly version of grill safety rules, complete with his own drawings. Jack smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course, buddy. That's what today is all about." The workshop began with Jack demonstrating modern safety features, but the real moment of impact came when Mr. Peterson stepped forward to speak. His voice was shaky at first, but grew stronger as he shared his story. "5 years ago, I had what you all have," he said, gesturing to the families seated before him. "Sunday gatherings, birthday parties, watching my kids play in the yard. I thought we were being safe. I thought we knew what we were doing. But one mistake, one unchecked equipment failure. A baby started crying somewhere in the crowd, and Mr. Peterson had to stop for a moment, his eyes closed. Jack stepped closer, offering silent support, and Susan quickly wiped away tears. "I've been angry," Mr. Peterson continued, "at the world, at myself, at anyone who reminded me of what I'd lost. When I moved here and saw the Anderson family's BBQs, it was like watching my own memories play out again. I was terrified that history would repeat itself." He turned to look at Jack. "But someone wise showed me that fear doesn't have to control us, that maybe my family's story could help protect others." Rachel, who had been filming the workshop for the community website, lowered her camera, too moved to continue. She watched as her father walked forward and stood beside Mr. Peterson. "We can't eliminate every risk," Jack added, "but we can learn, we can prepare, and we can look out for each other. That's what community is about." The workshop continued with practical demonstrations, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. Neighbors who had once whispered about Mr. Peterson's odd behavior now approached him with gentle questions and words of support. Children who had feared him gathered around as he explained the importance of smoke detectors in simple terms they could understand. Mrs. Wilson brought over her famous apple pie during the break. "Robert," she said kindly, using his first name for the first time, We've all been wondering if you'd join our neighborhood watch. We could use someone with your attention to detail." Mr. Peterson looked startled, then touched. I'd like that," he said quietly. As the afternoon wound down, Jack found Mr. Peterson standing alone, staring at the pamphlet with his family's photo. "You did good today," Jack said softly. "I forgot," Mr. Peterson replied, his voice thick with emotion, "what it felt like to help people, to be part of something." He looked up at the sky, where clouds were turning pink with sunset. "My wife would have liked this. She always said that teaching others was the best way to honor someone's memory." The workshop hadn't just been about grilling safety. It had been about breaking down walls, about turning pain into purpose, about finding the courage to face your deepest fears and use them to protect others. As neighbors lingered to chat and share stories, the community felt closer than ever before, bound together by a deeper understanding of how precious their Sunday gatherings truly were. The days grew shorter as autumn settled in, but the neighborhood had never felt warmer. The change started small. Mr. Peterson joining the morning dog walkers group, offering safety tips during their strolls. Then came his suggestion for a community garden, right in the space between his house and the Andersons. "My daughter loved growing flowers," he said one morning, as he and Jack marked out plots in the soil. "She used to say every garden needs both sunshine and rain to grow." He paused, running dirt through his fingers. "Just like people, I suppose." The garden became a healing space. Tommy planted sunflowers, their bright faces reaching toward the sky. Rachel added herbs that filled the air with fresh scents, helping to create new memories over old ones. Other neighbors contributed too: vegetables, flowers, even a small pond with water lilies. One Saturday, while planting fall bulbs, Mr. Peterson found something in the soil, a small, tarnished locket. He recognized it immediately. It had fallen from his wife's neck the day they moved in, and he'd been too angry then to look for it. "The ground gave it back," he said softly, showing it to Jack. Inside was a tiny photo of his family, somehow preserved despite the dirt and time. "Maybe it's a sign." That evening, as sunset painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, Mr. Peterson did something unexpected. He walked over to the Andersons' back porch, where the grill had stood silent for weeks. "Jack," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, "I've been thinking. The kids miss your Sunday cookouts. The whole neighborhood does." He took a deep breath. "Maybe it's time to try again. But this time, let me help make it safe." Susan, who had been watering the garden, dropped her watering can in surprise. Jack stepped forward, studying his neighbor's face. "Are you sure?" Mr. Peterson nodded. "I can't keep living in fear." And he glanced at the garden, where Tommy's sunflowers swayed gently in the breeze. "I think my family would want me to find peace." The next few days were filled with preparation. Mr. Peterson threw himself into it with the same intensity he'd once shown in his complaints, but now channeled into something positive. He and Jack installed every safety feature they could think of: wind monitors, heat sensors, automatic shoot-offs. They created detailed checklists and emergency procedures. Word spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Wilson offered to bring her famous potato salad. The young couple from down the street volunteered to set up tables. Even the grumpy old man from the corner house said he'd come, bringing his secret recipe barbecue sauce. Rachel found her dad in the garage, cleaning the grill grates with meticulous care. "You're really good at this, you know," she said. "At cleaning?" Jack asked, looking up. "At helping people heal," she replied. "At knowing when to push and when to wait." Jack smiled, thinking of all the small steps that had led to this moment. "Sometimes people just need to know they're not alone," he said. "That their pain matters, but it doesn't have to define them forever." The day before the planned cookout, Mr. Peterson spent hours in his garage, emerging with something covered in a sheet. It was a memorial plaque, beautifully crafted in wood and metal, with safety guidelines engraved alongside the names of his wife and children. "Could we put this up?" he asked quietly. Not as a warning, but as a reminder that every family gathering is precious. Jack helped him mount it near the garden, where the setting sun made the metal gleam. They stood there in silence, two men who had started as adversaries and become something else entirely, not quite friends yet, but fellow travelers on a journey of healing. That evening, as fireflies began to dance in the growing darkness, the neighborhood felt different. The garden between the two houses bloomed with new life. The memorial plaque stood as a bridge between past and present, and the covered grill waited for tomorrow's gathering. Not just a cookout, but a celebration of community, healing, and the courage it takes to begin again. 1 year later, on a bright Sunday afternoon, the Andersons' backyard was filled with the sounds of laughter and friendly chatter. The once controversial grill was now the centerpiece of a monthly neighborhood safety demonstration, with Mr. Peterson leading the instructions. "Remember, everyone," he said, adjusting his safety-first apron, a Christmas gift from Tommy. "Always check your wind monitor before lighting up." His voice was strong and clear, no longer carrying the weight of unspoken pain. Children sat cross-legged on the grass, watching intently as he demonstrated proper safety techniques. Jack stood at the grill, carefully arranging burgers while following the checklist they'd developed together. The list was laminated and posted nearby, with both men's signatures at the bottom. What had started as a source of conflict had become a symbol of transformation. "You know," Mr. Peterson said, stepping beside Jack, "Katie would have been 14 today." He smiled softly, watching Rachel teach younger kids how to use a fire extinguisher. She would have loved all this: the teaching, the community, the way everyone looks out for each other now. The garden between their houses had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. Tommy's sunflowers had multiplied, creating a cheerful border along the fence. The memorial plaque caught the sunlight, its message of remembrance and hope touching everyone who read it. Mrs. Wilson arrived with her famous potato salad, setting it next to a dish Mr. Peterson had brought. His wife's recipe for coleslaw, shared for the first time since the tragedy. "Martha would be proud," she said gently, patting his arm. "Both of your cooking and everything else." The neighborhood had changed too. What started as safety workshops had grown into regular community events. People looked out for each other more, checked in on their neighbors, shared resources and knowledge. The story of the angry neighbor and the patient firefighter had become a testament to the power of understanding and second chances. Tommy tugged at Mr. Peterson's sleeve. "Can you tell us the story about the safety sensors again?" he asked eagerly. Other kids gathered around, already knowing the tale but wanting to hear it once more. Mr. Peterson sat down in the grass, surrounded by children. "Well," he began, his eyes twinkling, "it all started with a very scared man who thought he was protecting people by pushing them away. But sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let people help us heal." Jack watched from the grill, remembering that rainy day a year ago when everything had changed. The smoke from the grill now carried the scent of not just food, but of healing, community, and new beginnings. Rachel approached with her camera, documenting another successful neighborhood gathering. "Dad," she said softly, "look at this." She showed him a photo she'd just taken, Mr. Peterson laughing with the kids, his face transformed by joy. The memorial plaque visible in the background, framed by blooming flowers. "Sometimes," Jack replied, flipping a burger, "the best endings come from the hardest beginnings." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, neighbors lingered, nobody wanting the day to end. The garden lights came on automatically, another safety feature they'd added together, creating a warm glow over the gathering. Mr. Peterson stood up, brushing grass from his knees. "Same time next month?" he asked, though everyone already knew the answer. These gatherings had become more than just cookouts. They were a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, understanding, and community. Later that evening, as the last neighbors headed home, Jack and Mr. Peterson stood in the garden they'd built together. The memorial plaque gleamed in the twilight, but it no longer brought just sadness. It had become a symbol of how pain could be transformed into purpose. "Thank you," Mr. Peterson said simply, looking at the home that had once seemed like a threat, but now felt like a sanctuary. "For not giving up on me." "That's what neighbors do," Jack replied, understanding all the words that didn't need to be said. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the smoke from the cooling grill drifted upward, carrying with it the story of two men who had learned that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to help others build a safer future.